What if the Renaissance was not a rebirth of Europe, but the slow and methodical emptying of someone else's vaults? What if the golden age of art, cathedrals, and kings was powered not by genius alone, but by stockpiles inherited from a world that had already fallen silent? When we hear the word Renaissance, we imagine Florence bathed in warm Tuscan light. We see Michelangelo chiseling marble into immortal form. We picture Leonardo sketching impossible machines, and merchants in velvet cloaks counting coins in candlelit chambers. The narrative is comforting. Europe, emerging from the so-called Dark Ages, rediscovers classical wisdom. Ancient Rome is reborn. Civilization awakens. But when we look more closely at Renaissance history, at the scale of its construction, the sudden flood of marble, bronze, gold, manuscripts, and masterworks, an unsettling question begins to surface. Where did it all come from? Between the 14th and 16th centuries, Europe was recovering from catastrophe. The Black Death had erased nearly half the population in some regions. Entire villages vanished. Fields returned to wilderness. Trade networks fractured. And yet, within a few generations, we witness one of the greatest construction booms in human history. Cathedrals rose, palaces expanded, bronze doors were cast on a monumental scale, libraries filled with rediscovered texts. The Medici bankrolled art that required staggering material wealth, marble, gold leaf, lapis lazuli imported from distant lands, massive bronze castings weighing tons, all in a continent that had just endured demographic collapse. Official history tells us this was a cultural awakening, an intellectual renaissance fueled by rediscovered classical texts, growing trade networks, and the rise of powerful banking families. We are told that Europe looked back to Rome and Greece and decided to revive their glory. It sounds poetic, almost inevitable. But economics is not poetic. Stone must be quarried. Bronze must be mined and smelted. Gold must be extracted. Timber must be felled. Laborers must be fed. Infrastructure must function. So we begin our investigation not with paintings, but with logistics. In cities like Florence, Rome, Venice, and Paris, Renaissance builders constructed domes that rivaled ancient engineering. Filippo Brunelleschi's dome for Florence Cathedral, completed in 1436, remains an architectural marvel, but building it required enormous quantities of brick, stone, iron chains, scaffolding systems, and skilled manpower. This was not a modest revival. It was an industrial undertaking, and Florence was not alone. Rome experienced a construction surge after the sack of 1527. St. Peter's Basilica, one of the largest churches in the world, began rising in 1506. France embarked on vast chateau projects along the Loire. Spain funded cathedrals and imperial palaces while expanding overseas. Venice built and rebuilt its maritime empire in stone. Across Europe, kings and princes seemed to be wearing out vast reserves of wealth. The question becomes unavoidable. Were these resources freshly produced, or were they inherited? Hidden history often hides in plain sight. We walk through Renaissance cities today and admire their symmetry, their columns, their grand facades. But look closer at many buildings, and you find something curious. Columns clearly older than the structures they support. Blocks of stone with Roman inscriptions embedded into medieval walls. Bronze melted down and recast from earlier monuments. Ancient ruins systematically dismantled. The official explanation is simple: recycling. Medieval and Renaissance builders reused Roman materials because it was convenient. But what if the scale of that reuse tells a different story? What if Europe's kings were not creating abundance from scratch, but drawing down reserves accumulated by previous civilizations? What if the Renaissance was less a birth and more a liquidation sale? In this documentary investigation, we will examine the timeline, 1453 and the fall of Constantinople, 1492 and the voyages of Columbus, 1347 and the plague that emptied Europe. We will analyze anomalies, pristine classical statues suddenly unearthed, gold appearing before New World mines reached peak output, cathedrals completed with suspicious speed despite population collapse. We will follow the metaphor of a vault, an inheritance vault passed down through catastrophe. And we will ask a simple, unsettling question: whose stockpiles were Europe's kings really wearing out? Because if the Renaissance was powered by inherited abundance, by the stripping of older infrastructure, forgotten cities, abandoned treasuries, then our understanding of European history shifts dramatically. The rebirth may not have been spontaneous brilliance emerging from darkness. It may have been the final chapter of something far older. And as we begin to pull on these threads, as we examine the marble quarries, the melted bronzes, the demographic records, we may discover that the Renaissance was not simply a cultural awakening. It may have been an extraction, and the deeper we dig into Renaissance history, the more that comforting narrative begins to fracture. But before we leap to conclusions, we must first understand the official story in full, how historians explain this extraordinary transformation, and what evidence they rely upon. Because only by examining the accepted version can we see where the cracks begin to form. And those cracks are wider than we have been told. To understand whether the Renaissance was looting or legitimate renewal, we must first stand firmly inside the official narrative. Historians place the beginning of the Renaissance in the 14th century, often in the city of Florence. The Black Death struck Europe in 1347, killing an estimated 30 to 50% of the population within just a few years. Entire regions were hollowed out, fields lay untilled, trade faltered, labor became scarce. By every conventional measure, Europe should have been weakened for generations. Yet something unexpected happened. In the decades following the plague, wages for surviving workers rose. Land became more available, wealth consolidated in fewer hands. Merchant families, most famously the Medici, expanded banking networks across Italy and beyond. Florence, Venice, and Genoa flourished through trade routes that connected Europe to the eastern Mediterranean. Then came 1453. The fall of Constantinople marked a turning point. When the Ottoman Empire captured the Byzantine capital, scholars and manuscripts fled westward. Classical Greek texts, many previously unknown in Western Europe, began circulating. This, we are told, ignited a cultural awakening. The rediscovery of Aristotle, Plato, and ancient geometry inspired artists and architects to emulate classical antiquity. The Renaissance, according to conventional history, was born of ideas. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west, opening the so-called Age of Exploration. Spain and Portugal expanded into the Americas. By the early 16th century, gold and silver from the New World began flowing into European treasuries. In 1521, Hernán Cortés defeated the Aztec Empire. In 1533, Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca. Later, the great silver mines of Potosi would supply unprecedented quantities of bullion to Spain. The timeline appears clean. Plague, recovery, rediscovery of classical learning, expansion overseas, influx of wealth, cultural flowering. It is a compelling sequence. But let us examine it more closely. The demographic collapse of the Black Death did indeed raise wages, but it also decimated skilled labor. Cathedral builders, masons, quarry workers, and metallurgists did not simply regenerate overnight. Complex trades require apprenticeship chains that span decades. If half the population vanished in a matter of years, those chains were broken. And yet, within a century, Europe embarked on massive construction programs. Consider Florence Cathedral. Construction began in 1296, but stalled for decades. By the early 1400s, the Great Dome remained unbuilt, an engineering puzzle thought impossible. Filippo Brunelleschi's solution was revolutionary. His dome, completed in 1436, required innovative machinery, hoisting systems, and mathematical precision. This was not a modest structure. It dominated the skyline. Now consider Rome. After suffering decline through the medieval period, Rome experienced a dramatic building resurgence in the 15th and 16th centuries. Pope Julius II initiated the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in 1506. The scale was colossal. Marble was transported, foundations laid, columns raised, artists commissioned at staggering cost. France mirrored this trend. The Loire Valley filled with Renaissance chateaux in the early 1500s. Spain built Escorial later in the century, a vast palace-monastery complex. Venice maintained monumental architecture while funding maritime fleets. All of this required stone, timber, metals, and manpower, and this is where subtle inconsistencies begin to appear. First, the influx of New World bullion did not reach its peak until the mid to late 16th century, especially after the development of large-scale silver extraction in Potosi around the 1540s. Yet major Renaissance projects began earlier. Brunelleschi's Dome predates large American silver imports. Early Renaissance bronze works were cast before the Great Bullion Wave. Second, quarrying and mining operations on the scale required for such projects leave records, labor contracts, wage lists, tax assessments. Some records exist, certainly, but when compared to the visible output, the sheer volume of marble and stone in Renaissance cities, questions arise about scale versus documentation. Third, the Renaissance obsession with classical Rome resulted in systematic dismantling of ancient structures. The Colosseum was quarried for stone. Roman baths were stripped. Marble columns were removed and reused in churches and palaces. Bronze from ancient monuments was melted down. Officially, this was pragmatic recycling. Medieval builders reused Roman ruins because it was easier than quarrying new stone. But think carefully about that. If Roman ruins were so abundant, so structurally sound, so accessible that they could supply centuries of Renaissance construction, then the material inheritance from antiquity must have been vast. And here lies a deeper tension. Rome itself, at the height of its empire, was said to have housed over 1 million inhabitants. By the early Middle Ages, its population fell dramatically. Some estimates place it below 50,000. The city became a landscape of ruins. Aqueducts stood broken. Forums lay abandoned. Yet these ruins did not vanish. They remained. So, when Renaissance builders revived classical style, were they creating something new or harvesting what was already there? Let us also consider manuscripts. Renaissance humanists celebrated the rediscovery of ancient texts. Many were found in monasteries, dusty and neglected. But the volume of surviving classical literature suggests preservation through centuries of turmoil. Libraries existed. Archives survived. Why were these materials not fully integrated earlier? Why did intellectual rebirth coincide so closely with material extraction from ancient sites? The official narrative tells us this was coincidence, a cultural shift aligning with economic growth. But as investigators, we must remain attentive to patterns. The Black Death reduced population but increased per capita wealth for survivors. The fall of Constantinople shifted intellectual centers westward. Overseas expansion promised new resources. At the same time, Europe's landscape was littered with the remnants of prior empires. Stone vaults, aqueducts, amphitheaters, roads, statues, metals embedded in architecture. We are looking at a continent sitting atop layers of accumulated infrastructure, and when crisis thinned the population and power consolidated into fewer hands, those in control may have gained access not merely to new wealth, but to inherited stockpiles. The official story frames the Renaissance as a sunrise, but from another angle, it may resemble something else. A society rediscovering and gradually consuming the reserves left behind by civilizations that had already peaked. We must not jump ahead yet. We are still assembling the pieces, because in the next stage of our investigation, we will move beyond background and into specific anomalies, evidence that strains the official explanation and forces us to ask whether Europe's kings were not simply inspired by antiquity, but dependent upon it. And as we examine these clues one by one, the pattern may become impossible to ignore. Now we begin to examine the anomalies, the loose threads that, when pulled carefully, begin to unravel the comfortable tapestry of Renaissance history. We will not theorize yet. We will simply observe. The first anomaly is material inheritance on a scale that defies casual explanation. Throughout Italy, France, Spain, and even parts of England, Renaissance buildings incorporate visibly older components. Roman columns stand beneath medieval arches. Marble blocks bearing Latin inscriptions are embedded sideways into cathedral walls. Ancient foundations form the base of new palaces. The Pantheon in Rome, built nearly 1,300 years before the Renaissance, still stood largely intact, its dome an engineering marvel that Renaissance architects openly studied and imitated. But here is the question: how much of Renaissance construction was genuinely new, and how much was reassembly? When we examine St. Peter's Basilica, begun in 1506, we find that large quantities of marble were quarried. But we also find extensive reuse of ancient Roman stone. The Colosseum, once a symbol of imperial Rome, was gradually stripped for building material. Roman baths were dismantled, temples were converted, reshaped, or harvested. Officially, this was pragmatic recycling. Stone is heavy and costly to transport. If ancient ruins provided ready-cut blocks, why not use them? Yet the scale matters. If Renaissance Europe could sustain 2 centuries of monumental construction simply by mining the ruins of antiquity, then the stockpiles left behind by Rome must have been enormous, far beyond what a collapsed civilization would ordinarily leave accessible. The second anomaly is the timeline of precious metals. The popular narrative credits New World gold and silver for funding Europe's cultural explosion. Certainly, by the mid-16th century, Spanish fleets transported massive silver shipments from Potosi and Zacatecas. But consider the dates carefully. Brunelleschi's Dome was completed in 1436, decades before Columbus sailed in 1492. Lorenzo Ghiberti's bronze doors for the Florence Baptistery were cast in the early 1400s. The Medici were commissioning art before American bullion began flowing at scale. Large bronze castings require immense quantities of copper and tin. Gold leaf for altarpieces requires refined gold. Pigments like ultramarine, derived from lapis lazuli, were among the most expensive materials in Europe. Where did the capital for these undertakings originate before the transatlantic treasure fleets reached maturity? Yes, Europe had trade networks. Yes, it had mining operations in Central Europe. But when we compare known mining output with visible artistic expenditure, the numbers sometimes strain credulity. The third anomaly concerns construction speed. Across Europe, cathedrals that had languished incomplete for centuries suddenly reached completion in the 15th and 16th centuries. In some cases, vast expansions occurred within a few decades. France's Gothic cathedrals were extended. Italian city-states upgraded civic buildings. Even smaller towns saw ambitious architectural projects. Yet Europe's population, still recovering from plague cycles that recurred throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, had not fully rebounded to pre-Black Death levels. Skilled masons are not conjured overnight. Quarry systems require coordinated labor. Transportation of stone demands animals, roads, and manpower. If we consider the mathematics of labor, assuming a significant percentage of the workforce perished in 1347 and subsequent outbreaks, the surge in construction appears abrupt. The fourth anomaly is the condition of rediscovered antiquities. During the Renaissance, classical statues and artworks were unearthed with surprising frequency. The Laocoon statue was discovered in 1506. The Apollo Belvedere gained prominence. Fragments of Roman sculpture emerged from beneath soil and were immediately celebrated as masterpieces. But here is the curious detail. Many of these works were in remarkably good condition. Marble exposed to centuries of weathering typically shows severe erosion. Bronze left unprotected corrodes extensively. Yet numerous pieces appeared almost theatrically preserved. Damaged, yes, but intact enough to inspire immediate imitation. Were these statues truly buried and forgotten for 1,000 years? Or were some stored, preserved, or even continuously known to select custodians? The fifth anomaly involves urban emptiness. After the Black Death, vast tracts of land were abandoned. Historical records speak of ghost villages and reclaimed forests. Yet infrastructure, roads, bridges, aqueduct remnants remained in place. Cities shrank, but did not entirely vanish. It is as if Europe inherited the shell of a more populated world. When Renaissance rulers began consolidating power, they did not start from bare earth. They ruled over landscapes already structured by prior empires. Let us step back and look at these anomalies together. First, extensive reuse of ancient materials. Second, significant artistic and architectural expenditure before New World bullion peaked. Third, construction booms despite demographic contraction. Fourth, pristine rediscoveries of classical artifacts. Fifth, inherited infrastructure from earlier civilizations. Each, taken alone, has an explanation. Recycling is practical. Banking families were wealthy. Some mines existed in Europe. Statues can survive underground. Plague recovery can be rapid. But together they form a pattern. It is as if Renaissance Europe found itself in possession of vast reserves. Stone vaults filled with marble, treasuries stocked with metal, archives of manuscripts, accumulated by civilizations that had already invested centuries in building and storing wealth. Imagine entering a city whose previous inhabitants had vanished, leaving warehouses untouched. You would not need to create everything from scratch. You would reorganize, repurpose, rebrand. Could this be what we are witnessing in Renaissance history? Not pure invention, but strategic extraction. Loose threads are beginning to connect. Because when we examine demographic data alongside construction volume, when we compare known mining output with artistic expenditure, when we analyze the physical evidence of reused Roman stone embedded in Renaissance walls, the tapestry begins to shift in tone, and in the next phase of our investigation, we will attempt to connect these anomalies, not as isolated curiosities, but as components of a single emerging pattern. Because patterns, once visible, are difficult to ignore, and what they suggest may change how we see the so-called rebirth of Europe forever. Now we begin to connect the threads. Up to this point, we have only observed anomalies, material inheritance, Boolean timelines, demographic contraction, preserved antiquities, inherited infrastructure. Each could be dismissed in isolation, but when placed side by side, they begin to form the outline of something larger. Let us start with a simple exercise in scale. In 1347, the Black Death entered Europe. By 1351, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the continent's population had perished. In Italy alone, some cities lost over 60% of their inhabitants. Florence, often considered the cradle of the Renaissance, was devastated. Chroniclers describe streets filled with the dead. Population recovery was slow and uneven. Plague outbreaks returned periodically throughout the 15th century. By 1400, Europe was still significantly underpopulated compared to its early 14th century peak. And yet by 1436, Florence completed the largest masonry dome in the world. Let us consider what that implies. Constructing Brunelleschi's dome required not just masons and laborers, but engineers, mathematicians, rope makers, brick manufacturers, blacksmiths, quarry workers, and transport teams. Bricks had to be fired in massive quantities. Iron chains were forged to stabilize the structure. Hoisting machines, innovative for their time, were designed and built from scratch. All of this in a city that had recently buried tens of thousands of its citizens. Now we could argue that Florence's surviving population simply reorganized and concentrated its labor. Perhaps wealth consolidation allowed ambitious projects to proceed with fewer hands. That is plausible. But expand the lens outward. Rome began constructing St. Peter's Basilica in 1506. Venice funded monumental works while maintaining fleets. France expanded castles along the Loire in the early 1500s. Spain financed both domestic architecture and overseas expeditions simultaneously. This was not one isolated city rebounding heroically. It was a continental pattern. The deeper we dig, the more puzzling it becomes. Let us look at marble. Quarrying marble is labor-intensive. Blocks must be cut from mountain sides, transported over land, often by animal power, and then shaped. The famous Carrara quarries supplied Renaissance sculptors. But records from the 15th century indicate that these quarries were not operating at anything close to the scale implied by the visible output in art and architecture across Europe. At the same time, ancient Roman structures provided ready-shaped marble blocks. The baths of Caracalla, the Colosseum, forums, temples, all contained stone already cut, already transported centuries earlier. From a purely logistical standpoint, dismantling existing structures would be vastly more efficient than extracting fresh material from remote mountains. Now let us consider metals. Large bronze castings, such as Ghiberti's doors, required tons of metal. Bronze production depends on copper and tin, both of which require mining and smelting infrastructure. European mining did exist, especially in regions like Saxony and Bohemia, but output records suggest limited capacity before the mid-16th century mining boom. Meanwhile, ancient Rome had produced countless bronze statues, architectural fittings, and military equipment. If Renaissance authorities melted down Roman bronze monuments, they would gain immediate access to high-quality alloy without the need for new extraction. In fact, documented evidence confirms that bronze from the Pantheon's portico was removed and repurposed during the Renaissance. This is not speculation, it happened. Now ask yourself, how much more ancient material was repurposed without detailed records? Let us apply simple arithmetic. If a Renaissance city inherited the ruins of an empire that once supported a population of 1 million, and that empire had invested centuries accumulating stone, metal, aqueduct systems, roads, and civic buildings, then the material wealth embedded in those ruins would be staggering. Even if the Renaissance population was half the size, it would possess access to infrastructure originally built for a much larger society. In other words, Renaissance Europe may have been living inside the shell of a previous peak, like heirs occupying a mansion too large for their diminished household. This metaphor of inheritance becomes increasingly powerful. Consider manuscripts. Monasteries preserved ancient texts throughout the Middle Ages. But the Renaissance narrative emphasizes dramatic rediscovery. Humanists claimed to uncover forgotten works in dusty libraries. Were these texts truly unknown? Or were they selectively revived when political and economic conditions made their revival advantageous? The idea of a rebirth is compelling branding. It suggests renewal, vitality, forward motion. But what if it also masked a more pragmatic reality? What if Europe's elites recognized that they possessed access to vast reserves, physical, intellectual, architectural, accumulated by prior civilizations, and chose to reorganize and reframe that inheritance as a new golden age? Patterns begin to emerge. First, demographic collapse reduces population but leaves infrastructure intact. Second, political consolidation places that infrastructure under centralized control. Third, material extraction from ancient ruins supplements limited contemporary production. Fourth, cultural rebranding transforms inherited assets into symbols of rebirth. When we view the Renaissance through this lens, it resembles less a spontaneous sunrise and more the methodical opening of an old vault. And here is where tension escalates. If Renaissance Europe depended heavily on inherited stockpiles, on dismantling, repurposing, and consuming the material legacy of antiquity, then the golden glow of the era conceals a quieter reality. It was drawing down reserves, like a kingdom spending from a treasure chest filled long ago. But the ultimate question remains unanswered. Whose treasure chest was it? Were these simply the remains of classical Rome? Or was there something even older? An accumulation of wealth and infrastructure whose origins stretch further back than our textbooks comfortably admit. We are approaching the breaking point of our investigation. Because if the Renaissance was not merely inspired by antiquity, but materially dependent upon it, then the concept of rebirth becomes unstable. And in the next stage, we will confront the hypothesis directly. Not cautiously, but boldly. All these clues point toward one almost uncomfortable conclusion. The Renaissance may not have been powered primarily by new creation. It may have been fueled by systematic extraction. Not invention, but inheritance. Not spontaneous abundance, but liquidation of accumulated wealth. If we follow the metaphor, we have been assembling the vault. Then the pattern becomes clearer. Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries was a continent that had suffered catastrophic depopulation. Yet it still stood atop layers of infrastructure built for far larger societies. Roman aqueducts, roads, amphitheaters, temples, bronze statuary, marble forums, administrative archives, these were not erased by plague. They remained, embedded in the landscape. Imagine inheriting a vast estate after generations of consolidation. The estate contains storehouses of grain, vaults of metal, libraries of manuscripts, quarries already cut, foundations already laid. But your household is smaller than the one that built it. Your labor force diminished, your economic base unstable. What would you do? You would reorganize. You would centralize. You would strip unused wings of the mansion to reinforce the ones you still inhabit. You would melt down heirlooms to cast new symbols of authority. You would take columns from abandoned halls and erect them in your new palace, and you would call it renewal. This hypothesis does not deny artistic genius. Michelangelo was brilliant. Leonardo was visionary. Brunelleschi was innovative. But genius requires material substrate. Marble must exist before it can be sculpted. Bronze must be available before it can be cast. What if Renaissance rulers were not conjuring wealth from thin air, but drawing down stockpiles accumulated across centuries? Consider Rome specifically. By the early Middle Ages, Rome's population had collapsed dramatically from its imperial height. Entire districts lay deserted. Structures stood abandoned. The Colosseum, once seating tens of thousands, became a quarry. Marble revetments were stripped. Iron clamps were removed. Bronze fixtures melted. But how much material did Imperial Rome originally contain? We must think in terms of accumulation across centuries of conquest and trade. Rome taxed provinces from Britain to Egypt. It imported stone, metals, and treasure continuously. Imperial monuments represented immense concentrations of resources. When that empire contracted, its physical legacy remained concentrated in cities. By the time Renaissance popes and princes asserted control over Rome, they presided not over an empty plain, but over a treasure field of cut stone and refined metal. Now widen the lens beyond Rome. Throughout Europe, medieval towns were often built atop Roman foundations. Roads followed ancient routes. Bridges reused Roman piers. Defensive walls incorporated older masonry. The landscape itself functioned as a palimpsest. Layers of civilizations written atop one another. If plague and political fragmentation reduced population but left these layers intact, then later rulers would inherit disproportionate access to infrastructure relative to their manpower. This creates a powerful asymmetry. A smaller elite could command the material remnants of a much larger past. Now revisit the anomalies. Why did Renaissance building rely so heavily on Roman stone? Because it was available. Why did early Renaissance art flourish before American silver peaked? Because internal reserves, banked wealth, inherited metals, and recycled bronze were sufficient. Why were statues rediscovered in relatively good condition? Because some may not have been exposed to centuries of uncontrolled decay. They may have been stored, protected, or only partially buried. Why did the narrative emphasize rebirth? Because framing inheritance as innovation strengthens legitimacy. It transforms consumption into creation. This hypothesis turns the Renaissance from a spontaneous miracle into a transitional phase, a period of reorganization after civilizational contraction. It suggests that Europe's kings were wearing out stockpiles that were not fully their own making. And if this is true, it reframes the age of exploration as well. When domestic reserves begin to thin, when the inherited vault is no longer sufficient, expansion becomes necessary. Overseas conquest provides new influxes of bullion to sustain monumental projects. Spain's American silver may have prolonged the cycle of consumption. In this light, 1492 becomes not merely discovery, but extension of an extraction pattern already underway. As unbelievable as it may sound, this interpretation aligns the Renaissance with a broader historical rhythm. Civilizations peak, accumulate vast infrastructure, then contract. Successor elites inherit the shell, repurpose its materials, and rebrand the era as renewal. The final piece of the puzzle falls into place. The Renaissance was not a simple rebirth. It was a managed inheritance, a drawing down of accumulated wealth left behind by prior peaks of civilization, especially Rome, but perhaps even older strata embedded beneath. This does not diminish the art. It magnifies the context, because when we view Renaissance Europe not as a phoenix rising from ashes, but as heirs opening an ancient vault, the narrative becomes more complex, more sobering, and perhaps more honest. But bold hypotheses demand scrutiny. If this interpretation is correct, then evidence must exist beyond architectural reuse and timeline tensions. There must be broader patterns, cross-cultural echoes, and data points that reinforce the idea of systematic extraction rather than spontaneous production. So in the next phase, we will confront skepticism head-on. Is there proof that Europe's kings were wearing out inherited stockpiles? Or are we reading too much into scattered anomalies? The answer lies in examining the remaining evidence, carefully, calmly, and without illusion. A bold hypothesis is only as strong as the weight it can bear. If we are suggesting that the Renaissance functioned as a period of inherited extraction, of drawing down material reserves accumulated by earlier civilizations, then we must confront both supporting evidence and counter-arguments directly. The first counter-argument is obvious. New World silver. Beginning in the mid-16th century, especially after the discovery of the Potosi Silver Mountain in 1545, Spain flooded Europe with unprecedented quantities of bullion. Historians estimate that thousands of tons of silver crossed the Atlantic in the following decades. This influx contributed to price inflation across Europe and funded imperial ambitions. Does this not explain the wealth of the Renaissance? Partially, but timing matters. Brunelleschi's Dome was completed in 1436. Ghiberti's bronze doors were finished decades before Potosi. Leonardo da Vinci was active in the late 15th century. Michelangelo began work in Rome before the full American silver wave transformed European economies. The early Renaissance boom predates peak transatlantic extraction. Yes, trade with the East brought spices and luxury goods. Yes, banking networks multiplied capital. Yes, European mines in Saxony and Tyrol produced metals. But when we compare the scale of monumental output with documented mining capacity, questions persist about sufficiency. The second counter-argument is cultural revival. Historians argue that the Renaissance was primarily intellectual. The rediscovery of classical texts in 1453, following the fall of Constantinople, catalyzed artistic transformation. Humanism reshaped education. Artists adopted perspective, anatomy, and classical proportions. All of this is true, but ideas do not quarry marble. Intellectual revival explains style. It does not automatically explain material abundance. The third counter-argument is efficiency through consolidation. After the Black Death, fewer people controlled more land and capital. Surviving elites may have been able to mobilize labor more effectively. Urban centers could concentrate resources. Again, plausible. But this explanation assumes that material production scaled seamlessly despite demographic contraction. Skilled trades require generational continuity. Mines require sustained labor pools. Quarries require infrastructure. Let us now examine reinforcing evidence. Across Rome, detailed records show that Renaissance builders systematically dismantled ancient structures. The Colosseum lost massive quantities of stone to papal construction projects. The Pantheon's bronze was stripped in the 17th century. Earlier centuries saw similar repurposing. This was not incidental recycling. It was organized extraction. In Florence, architectural historians have identified reused Roman columns embedded in Renaissance buildings. In France, medieval cathedrals incorporate Roman stone from earlier settlements. Across Europe, ancient foundations underpin later palaces. The pattern is continental. Moreover, consider the economic concept of capital stock. A society's wealth is not merely coins in circulation. It includes infrastructure, roads, bridges, aqueducts, harbors, stone blocks already cut and transported, metal already refined and cast. Rome accumulated enormous capital stock over centuries. When imperial governance weakened, that stock did not evaporate. It remained physically present. If Renaissance elites controlled cities layered atop Roman infrastructure, they effectively inherited concentrated capital without bearing its original production costs. This inheritance would dramatically lower the barrier to monumental construction. Now let us address another subtle piece of evidence: quarry exhaustion. By the late Renaissance and early modern period, some European quarries show signs of depletion or increased difficulty. New extraction required deeper cuts and more labor. Similarly, European forests experience deforestation pressures due to shipbuilding and metallurgy. These signs suggest that inherited easy-access materials were eventually consumed. What about statues? Archaeological evidence confirms that many classical sculptures were buried in controlled environments. Collapsed buildings, filled-in spaces, protected courtyards. Burial can preserve marble remarkably well. But we must ask, why were so many high-quality works concentrated in recoverable urban zones? Because cities like Rome were dense repositories of artistic wealth. The Renaissance did not stumble randomly upon scattered fragments. It excavated within known centers of ancient accumulation. This reinforces the inheritance model. Now consider patterns beyond Italy. In Spain, imperial expansion funded grand projects. But Spain also inherited Roman infrastructure across Iberia. Aqueducts in Segovia still stand. Roads laid in antiquity shaped medieval trade routes. France's urban cores often trace back to Roman settlements. Across Europe, rulers governed landscapes pre-structured by previous imperial peaks. Alternative explanations, while valid in parts, struggle to account for the consistency of this inheritance dynamic. Yes, genius flourished. Yes, trade expanded. Yes, American bullion later amplified wealth. But the foundation upon which Renaissance Europe built, literally and figuratively, was not empty soil. It was layered stone. The metaphor of the vault returns with force. When we inherit a vault, we may not always recognize its origin. We may believe we have created what we are merely redistributing. We may celebrate innovation without acknowledging substrate. The Renaissance narrative emphasizes rebirth because it centers human agency and intellectual awakening. But perhaps it underemphasizes material continuity. Perhaps it overlooks the quiet reality that Europe's kings were wearing out reserves accumulated by civilizations that had already peaked and declined. This interpretation does not negate artistry. It reframes sustainability. If a civilization consumes inherited capital faster than it replenishes it, it experiences a temporary golden age, followed by new pressures for expansion. And here we see the bridge to empire. When domestic stockpiles thin, overseas extraction becomes attractive. In this light, the Renaissance is not merely a cultural phenomenon. It is a transitional economic phase between imperial inheritances. But what does this mean for us? If the glory of Europe's golden age rested partly on inherited reserves rather than pure rebirth, how does that alter our understanding of history, power, and narrative? We now turn from analysis to reflection, because the implications extend far beyond marble and bronze. If what we have traced is even partially true, then the Renaissance was not only a story about art, it was a story about memory, about what societies choose to remember, and what they quietly consume. For centuries, we have been told that the Renaissance marked the triumphant return of reason after darkness, that Europe awakened from medieval slumber and rediscovered the brilliance of Rome and Greece, that innovation replaced stagnation, that genius flourished because minds were finally free. But what if the transformation was less mystical? What if Europe did not rise from nothing, but reorganized what was already there? The implications are profound. First, it challenges the idea of linear progress. We tend to imagine history as a staircase, each era climbing higher than the last. But what if history moves more like a tide? Civilizations accumulate infrastructure, art, knowledge. They peak, they contract. Successor elites inherit the shell and reinterpret it. The Renaissance may represent one such reinterpretation. When we walk through Rome today and see Renaissance facades layered over ancient foundations, we are looking at continuity disguised as rebirth. The old city never vanished. It was rebranded. This matters because narrative shapes legitimacy. By framing the era as a Renaissance, a rebirth, rulers could position themselves as restorers of greatness rather than inheritors of decline. A pope commissioning St. Peter's Basilica was not simply recycling Roman stone. He was symbolically claiming continuity with imperial authority. Rebirth is powerful rhetoric. It suggests destiny, but inheritance suggests something more complex. It implies stewardship. It raises uncomfortable questions about depletion. If Renaissance Europe drew heavily from accumulated reserves, architectural, metallurgical, intellectual, then its golden age may have been sustained by capital formed long before. And capital, once consumed, does not automatically regenerate. This perspective also reframes the age of exploration. When Spain and Portugal expanded outward after 1492, was it purely curiosity, pure ambition, or was it partly economic necessity? If inherited domestic reserves were finite, overseas extraction provided replenishment. Empire, in this light, becomes extension of the same pattern. Draw down stockpiles, consolidate wealth, monumentalize authority. Seen this way, the Renaissance is not an isolated miracle. It is a pivot point in a larger cycle. There is also a psychological dimension. Societies often mythologize their peaks. We remember the art, the innovation, the masterpieces. We do not remember the quarries stripped from ancient amphitheaters. We do not dwell on bronze melted from prior monuments. We do not calculate how many inherited stones were rearranged to form new symbols of power. We prefer the image of creation, yet the truth may be quieter. The Renaissance may have been as much about reorganizing memory as producing novelty. Consider how the narrative of the Dark Ages itself emerged. Medieval centuries were framed as a void, a gap between Rome and Renaissance brilliance. But modern scholarship increasingly shows that the Middle Ages were far more complex, inventive, and dynamic than once believed. Why exaggerate darkness? Because light appears brighter by contrast. If the Renaissance was partially dependent on inherited structures, then emphasizing prior decay strengthens the illusion of rebirth. This does not mean historians are deceitful. Narratives evolve, interpretations shift. But power has always influenced which stories are amplified, and if Europe's kings and popes were consolidating inherited wealth, material and symbolic, then branding their era as a rebirth served political ends. Now step back even further. If history is cyclical, if civilizations accumulate, peak, contract, and leave behind layered infrastructure, then we must ask ourselves, what phase are we in? Are we building anew, or are we drawing down inherited capital from industrial revolutions past? From fossil fuels formed over eons? From infrastructure laid generations ago? The Renaissance becomes a mirror. It reminds us that golden ages often sit atop foundations built by others, that beauty can coexist with depletion, that rebirth may sometimes be reassembly. There is awe in this realization, but also humility. Michelangelo's David remains magnificent. Leonardo's notebooks remain astonishing. Brunelleschi's Dome still dominates Florence's skyline. Their achievements are undeniable. But perhaps what we are truly seeing is genius operating within inherited abundance. The truth was always there, embedded in reused columns, in melted bronze, in foundations older than the facades they support, hidden in plain sight. The Renaissance was not a lie. It was incomplete. It celebrated inspiration while underemphasizing substrate. It glorified rebirth while quietly consuming inheritance. And if we are willing to see history not as isolated miracles, but as layered continuities, we gain a deeper, more grounded understanding of civilization itself. The vault metaphor returns one final time. Every society inherits something, material, intellectual, cultural. The question is not whether inheritance exists. The question is whether we recognize it. Because when we fail to see what we are wearing out, we mistake consumption for creation. And history, patient and cyclical, records the difference. We began with a question that felt almost heretical. What if the Renaissance was not purely a rebirth, but a liquidation? We walked through Florence under the shadow of Brunelleschi's Dome. We stood in Rome beneath the rising walls of St. Peter's Basilica. We traced the timeline, 1347 and the Black Death, 1453 and the fall of Constantinople, 1492 and the outward expansion of Europe. We examined marble quarried from ancient ruins, bronze melted from imperial monuments, manuscripts revived from monastic vaults. And slowly, carefully, a different picture emerged. Not a denial of genius, but a reframing of abundance. The Renaissance, as traditionally told, is a story of awakening. Europe rediscovers classical knowledge. Artists revolutionize perspective. Banking families fuel creativity. New World silver floods treasuries. A continent rises from medieval obscurity into modern brilliance. Yet when we looked beneath the surface, at logistics, at material flow, at inherited infrastructure, we saw something else. We saw layers. We saw Roman roads shaping Renaissance trade. We saw marble already cut and waiting. We saw bronze recast from monuments centuries old. We saw cities built atop foundations laid by empires that had long since declined. And we asked a question that history rarely emphasizes. Whose stockpiles were Europe's kings really wearing out? If the Renaissance was powered partly by inherited capital, by accumulated stone, metal, and knowledge from prior peaks, then it was not a spontaneous sunrise. It was a reorganization of legacy, a managed inheritance. This does not diminish Michelangelo. It does not erase Leonardo. It does not reduce the magnificence of Renaissance art. It deepens it. Because genius operating within inherited abundance is still genius. But it reminds us that civilizations do not rise in vacuums. They build upon layers left behind. They inherit vaults, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unconsciously, and they decide how to spend what they inherit. The Renaissance may have been one of history's most beautiful spending sprees, and like all spending sprees, it carried consequences. As inherited Roman stockpiles thinned, Europe expanded outward. The age of exploration intensified. Silver from Potosi replaced melted bronze from the Pantheon. Overseas extraction supplemented domestic depletion. The pattern continued, just at a larger scale. This perspective shifts Renaissance history from miracle to mechanism, from isolated rebirth to transitional phase. And perhaps that is its true power, because when we recognize inheritance, we become more attentive to continuity. We stop seeing history as a series of disconnected explosions of brilliance and begin seeing it as a layered structure, each era resting on foundations built by others. The Renaissance was not an illusion, but the myth of total rebirth may be, and here is the final thought. If Europe's golden age was sustained by inherited reserves, then the phrase hidden history takes on new meaning. The hidden element is not secret conspiracies or forbidden documents. It is the quiet reality of material continuity. The stones beneath the facades, the metals within the recast statues, the manuscripts preserved long before they were celebrated. The truth was always embedded in the walls. We only needed to look closely enough to see it. And now, as we step back from this investigation, we are left with one enduring question, not just about the Renaissance, but about civilization itself. Are we creators of abundance, or are we heirs, spending what was accumulated before us? History rarely shouts its answers. It whispers them through stone, through reused columns, through foundations older than the names carved upon them. Our investigation into Renaissance history does not end here. There are more layers to uncover, more hidden continuities, more golden ages to re-examine. If you want to continue exploring these deeper currents, the hidden structures beneath the stories we are told, then join us. Subscribe and become part of this ongoing inquiry. And in the comments, tell us what you think. Was the Renaissance a true rebirth? Or was it the final chapter of a much older inheritance? The vault is still open. The question is whether we are willing to look inside.